Last Epoch is an action RPG developed by 11th Hour Games. It released a couple of weeks ago on Steam, and it is priced at around $35, and aside from a couple of server issues on launch, it's got mostly positive reviews. And it's best described right now as the middle ground between Diablo 4 and Path of Exile. So let's talk today about if Last Epoch is the next big ARPG, and if it's worth your time. So let's get into this review. I'm a big lover of action RPGs. I grew up playing the Diablo games, and I've played multiple seasons of Diablo 3, 4, Path of Exile, and I think Last Epoch really does fit its description. It fills the gap between those two games, where Path of Exile feels like it's made for really sweaty, hardcore ARPG fans with an insanely complex skill tree that you probably have to look up to understand, a really in-depth loot system, and so much content built up over the years that the skill ceiling is huge, compared to Diablo 4, which seems aimed at a more casual player base. So let's go over everything about this game and why it might be the perfect ARPG for you, and why it might not. First up, let's talk about classes and combat. Last Epoch lets you choose between 5 classes: the Mage, the Primalist, the Acolyte, the Rogue, or the Sentinel. And then each of these classes have 3 subclasses. And as you unlock these subclasses relatively early in the story, a few hours in, and they are fixed choices. So each of the subclasses feels like an independent class. A Void Knight feels significantly different to a Paladin. Even though they have the same base abilities and they come from the same starting class, they feel significantly different. Just like a Rogue still has its basic rogue skills, whether you play a Marksman or a Blade Dancer. And overall, the classes just feel good. Necromancers raise walkers, mages can do giant elemental destruction, and there are classes with pets, classes that can transform into different things, classes with huge weapons, dots, bleeds, curses. There's a lot of variety, and it really doesn't feel like you're playing a game with 5 classes, but more like a game with 15. There is a ton of diversity here, and if your enjoyment is in making builds and trying new things, this game will keep you busy for a long time. And the combat stays fun. It stays fun from the very start of the game when you have 2 abilities to the end game. I'd say there are maybe less mechanics than some of the other ARPGs out there, and the high-end combat relies more on avoiding stuff on the ground and having high resistances to not get one-shot. I can see why people might want more mechanics at endgame, but I personally like it. It feels challenging, it feels fast, and each boss has new and unique mechanics to spice things up. And where the combat might seem simple in places, the skill tree is where the depth of this game really comes in. The skill tree and the character progression in this game is incredible. It is one of the best I've played in any ARPG. There are 2 systems that count towards your progression. There is a passive system, a passive point system, and a skill tree. The passive system is basically passive points. So every time you level up and do quests, you get these passive points, and you can take things like +1 intelligence, +1 armor, plus 5% resistance, things like that. Passive things that don't really affect your gameplay, but make you stronger or make you more defensive. So you can choose where you want to go with that. And the beauty of this is, as you spend more points in a tree, you will unlock abilities from that tree. So say you're playing a Primalist Druid and you put points into the Beastmaster tree, you can get skills that a Beastmaster accesses, which is really interesting. If you're playing, say, a Mage Sorcerer and you put points into the Rune Master's passives, you will unlock Rune Master abilities. You won't get their key ability that defines their build, but you will get abilities from their passive tree, which is really, really interesting and really lets you be creative with your build. It kind of works how Classic WoW worked, where you could spec into other trees. So if you ever played Classic WoW, you'll be really familiar with this. And then you have the skill tree. And this is the real beauty. This needs to be celebrated. It needs to be talked about. And if you take nothing else from this video, this is the system that is the reason to play the game. This is something I will praise to no end. Every single skill in the game can be specialized into, and you can specialize into 5 skills at a time on your character. Each skill has a full skill tree. So your basic mage fireball could become an electric ball. You could change it so that it has tracking fireballs that chase enemies. You could have fireballs that explode on impact. And depending on where you put your points, that's how you can change that fireball spell. Or because you can spend like 20 odd points in here, you can put them in different places. So you could take the fireball, make it electric, and then make it explode on impact. Totally changing up the build and totally changing how the core skills work. The reason this is so fun is because the synergies you can make. So for example, the first character I made was a shaman, I believe. And when you looked at the different skills, there were certain things that work really well with each other. So there was one skill that you could turn into a tree-like creature, and then you could summon like a healing totem. And then if you took a different skill and you went down the skill tree of that skill, you could pick up these thorn totems, and then the thorn totems you could get like 5 of them or 6 of them. And then if you combine that in the tree form, you could turn your healing totems into thorn totems. And then because you've already powered up your thorn totems in the thorn tree, those two skills now make you so strong. And that's just 2 interactions in 2 skills of a giant web of skills that you could have picked from. I think as they balance the game more, you're going to watch someone play this game and it's constantly going to look different. And I think that's something that needs to be praised. Okay, and as you're progressing and you're putting all these points in, you're playing through the story. So let's talk about the story. The base of the story is about an evil force, a void that can take over the world. And the gameplay takes you across the world and you jump through different time zones and timelines to stop it. This involves going back to the age of dinosaurs, jumping into the future, fighting gods and monsters along the way. It's edgy, it's dark, and it's a really cool concept. For some reason, for me personally, the story itself didn't grip me. The zones themselves, the unique areas, the models, the variety of mobs, was all enough to keep the story fun and the progression really exciting. And I had a really good time playing from, level 1 to endgame, but I never really got hooked on the story. Even as a lover of fantasy and sci-fi that should enjoy, big evil threats and jumping through time, the story never really landed. The characters don't seem memorable. And as I've played through it 3 or 4 times, I really don't remember much of the story and it doesn't really hit. I feel like I'm playing more through the grass zone, the water zone, the dinosaur zone, the void zone, rather than the different chapters of the story, which is a bit of a disappointment. Compared to, say, Diablo 4's story, which it was vastly different for me. It's incredibly memorable. Every cutscene was jaw-dropping, building up to the final chapter and where that takes you, which was unforgettable. And the story of that game is something that I immediately jumped on Discord and talked to my friends about because I was so shocked at how good it was. So this was just my experience, and take that with a grain of salt. Everyone's different. You might love it, and I'm sure there's people who do. But for me, the story kind of didn't hit. Okay, but in hindsight, the story is a very small part of the game. So let's talk about the end game. Where you might spend 20, 30 hours on the main story, you could spend hundreds of hours on the end game. And a really well-designed end game can keep you playing for months. So how does Last Epoch hold up? It's good. It's really good, actually. Most of your time at endgame will be spent doing something called monoliths. And these are basically... they're basically these towers, and they are a collection of maps with quick objectives. So you start at a central point in a monolith, and you slowly branch out in different directions, choosing different paths. So you might take the path that has a rare helmet, or the path that has a key to something, or the path that has gold or experience as you level up. And every single time you pick an option, you're taken to a map with an objective, such as defeat a boss or survive through a few waves. And as you progress more and more and more, you build up the bar of this zone, and then you can challenge the boss. And that's your end game. Your end game is progressing through all 10 of these monoliths. And once you complete all 10, you can unlock them, and they all empower. So kind of the first monolith might be, I'm trying to remember, like 60, and then 65, 70, 75, and you progress through them. And then by the time you hit end game, you'll be around level 90, 100, and you can empower the monoliths, and then all monoliths turn to level 100. You can turn it off if you want, but they all turn to level 100. And you can play through every monolith and farm the gear, challenge the different bosses, and progress. Outside of these monoliths, there are also unique dungeons that all have special features. Completing one lets you spend gold on like chest rewards. Completing another lets you craft legendaries at the end of it. You can get keys for an arena where you can challenge more and more waves of enemies, and then even place on a leaderboard like a ladder, which is really cool. Overall, if you're coming from Diablo 4, you're going to be blown away at how fun and interactive the endgame is. I spent 2 full days just farming monoliths and listening to music, watching TV, and in some sort of trance because I was just having fun. I was just constantly making decisions and choosing directions and just enjoying progressing my character. As I went from like 60 to 100, it just felt incredibly fun. Compared to, say, Diablo, where you're just bashing your head against nightmare dungeons and messing around with your gear, and it felt a lot more tedious. On the flip side, this is nowhere near as complex as Path of Exile. It doesn't have as much agency over the maps. There's not as many like endgame systems that come together, and it doesn't have the same level of depth. But I don't think that's a bad thing. As long as the systems in the game are fun, that should be enough. And there are a lot of very fun systems at endgame. So I would say this is a really good one. And again, it fits the middle ground, which is what everyone keeps comparing it to. Okay, finally, let's talk about gear. This is kind of the main event, right? This is what action RPGs are all about. Hitting those enemies, turning them into giant loot pinatas, and getting better and better gear. And as you push into harder and harder endgames for rarer and stronger gear in Last Epoch, the gear progression is really good. Probably the second best thing I can say about this game after the skill tree for me is how they handle gear. Your gear comes in ranks from basic, rare, exalted, uniques, and then legendaries. Stats roll in tiers, so the higher tier of a stat you get, the better it is. There are loot filters to fine tune and to take away things on screen that you don't want to see. So you're already picking up the gear that you want, means you spend more time fighting and having fun than messing around with your gear in your inventory and worrying if you need to sell it or disenchant it, that kind of thing. They have an incredible target farming system. So something that is very important for me in ARPGs is grinding out that really best in slot gear. And they do it really well. The monoliths can be used to target farm specific things as you go down different paths and target certain bosses. And then there is these two factions you can join called the Merchants Guild, where you can trade, make gold, and then buy your best pieces, or the Circle of Fortune, where you can look for prophecies and they give you kind of like missions, like go and hunt a boss in this dungeon and you'll get 5 unique headpieces, things like that. So there are a lot of ways you can target the items you want and go and grind them out. So yeah, I would say that the gearing system in Last Epoch hits the perfect sweet spot of being fun and exciting and still really simple to understand. So overall, I think you're going to know where this is going, but should you buy Last Epoch? Should you play Last Epoch? Is it a good game? Absolutely. If you like ARPGs, action RPGs, this is not one to miss. It's really not. It has an incredible class and skill system that is really fun, both as a new player, just putting your points in and trying all this cool stuff out as you level is incredibly fun. And then at Endgame, it gets even more fun because you have the knowledge and you have the points to make really cool and fun builds. It's got a really progressive and fun endgame with a loot system that is up to scratch of what we would expect in the current time with the games it's competing with. It really does hold its own in this market. It lacks a lot of the systems and a lot of the depth that you might expect if you're coming from a game like Path of Exile, but for a game that's just had its full official release for the price it's offering, it has more than enough content to keep you busy and having fun. Its story might not hit as hard as, say, Diablo 4, but the core gameplay here and the progression that you can go through is well worth the price. I would highly recommend this game. I would say this is a fantastic game. It is one of the best in the genre, and I think this isn't just some niche little game that's released amongst a lot of bigger games. You know, you've already got like the big players, and this is just some small, you know, ARPG to try. I'd say this is up there. This is competing and has competing systems with some of the best. So yeah, that's the review. I think this is a fantastic game. Definitely worth your time, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. But that's the video. If you like this style of honest, open review, consider subscribing to the channel. I cover action RPGs, and MMOs all the time. And if you've got anything to add, let me know in the comments. There's a lot to cover in a review, so if I've missed something important, let people know. And I'm curious on your thoughts. If you play other action RPGs and you've came to this, did you like it? Did it meet your expectations? And if you've never played one and you just bought this on a whim, what did you think? But that's it from me. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next one.